A nation can claim religious identity while building institutions that intentionally separate religion from political power.
Right.
Why would a political system be designed to resist the identity many people believe it represents?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the system shaping our world. I'm so glad we're getting into this today.
Me too. It's a massive topic.
It really is. So for this deep dive, we have a huge stack of historical documents, legal analyses, and specifically, we're focusing heavily on a book called The Founding Myth: Why Christian Nationalism Is Un-American by constitutional attorney Andrew L. Seidel.
Yeah, and we need to clarify our mission right out of the gate here.
Absolutely.
Because rather than treating debates about religion and politics as, just personal conflicts between individuals or ideological shouting matches, this analysis approaches the subject strictly as a structural system.
Right, a structural system.
Exactly. We are examining how narratives about national identity actually influence institutional interpretation and political behavior.
But before we really unpack this, we need to make something very clear to you, the listener.
Yes. The source material we are examining today discusses highly politically charged topics. It references both right-wing and left-wing figures, religious movements, and specific political campaigns.
Right.
We are strictly here to analyze the structural systems and the historical arguments presented in the text. We do not take sides, nor do we endorse the political or religious viewpoints of the author or any of the figures mentioned.
Exactly.
Our goal is solely to help you understand the ideas and the systemic dynamics contained in the original source material. We're looking at the architecture of government.
Just the architecture. Which brings us to the core crisis in perception we're looking at today. There is this widespread, deeply ingrained belief that the United States was founded as a Christian nation.
We're it everywhere.
Everywhere.
Huh.
But according to Seidel and the historical analysis we're looking at, that belief does not arise from the institutional design of the American Republic itself.
No, not at all.
It actually emerges from later political narratives that connect religious identity with national legitimacy.
Yeah, and that's a crucial distinction. The blueprint says one thing, but the story we tell ourselves about the building says something completely different.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with this systems clash. We've got the institutional design on one side and the political narrative on the other.
Right. The narrative framework surrounding American national identity is, it's incredibly powerful, but it's based on terminology that, historically speaking, is actually shockingly new.
Okay, yeah, like the term Judeo-Christian value.
Exactly. We hear this constantly from politicians on both sides of the aisle.
All the time.
But Seidel points out that it's actually a relatively modern fabrication. It did not exist at the founding of the country.
Which is wild to think about.
Right. It really came into heavy rotation in the mid-20th century, largely post-Holocaust, and then it really accelerated during the Cold War.
So it was designed as a political shorthand.
Yes. It sounds inclusive, bringing Judaism and Christianity together, but in practice, within this narrative system, it's often used as a tool to define American identity according to a very specific exclusionary set of religious views.
So to be clear, the founders never sat around talking about Judeo-Christian values when they were drafting the Constitution.
Not once. The phrase would have been completely alien to them.
Wow.
And the use of that phrase today is the driving force behind a narrative system that the source material defines as Christian nationalism.
Right. And we need to define that term precisely for this deep dive.
We do, because it gets thrown around a lot in the media. In the context of our sources, Christian nationalism is not a religion.
It's not about theology.
Exactly. It's not about personal faith. It is an exclusionary political movement and a historical revisionist project.
A revisionist project.
Yes. Its goal is to redefine the Constitution and secure legal privilege by claiming a fabricated historical mandate.
Okay, so it's a political strategy masquerading as a religious movement. But from a systems perspective, why use religion? Why not just argue for your political policies directly?
Well, what's fascinating here is the sheer mechanical efficiency of this narrative system. Religious identity is arguably one of the most powerful forms of social cohesion humans have ever developed.
Oh, sure. It ties into community, morality, tradition.
Deep fears, high hopes, all of it. When a political movement links that deep-seated religious identity to national belonging, they activate incredibly strong signals of loyalty.
Right.
If I can convince you that to be a true citizen of this nation, You must align with my specific religious heritage. I don't just have a voter, I have a
Yeah.
mobilized defender of the faith.
It's basically an exclusionary tactic that's brilliantly disguised as patriotism.
Exactly.
I was looking at this one statistic from the research, and I had to read it twice because it completely blew my mind.
The 2016 data?
The 2016 data. Researchers were studying the presidential election to figure out what actually drove voters to the polls for Donald Trump. And normally break this down by looking at income brackets, education levels, geographic regions, or even...
often someone attends church.
Right, church attendance.
Yeah.
But the single most accurate predictor of whether a person voted for Donald Trump wasn't their wealth. It wasn't their education. It wasn't even their actual religious affiliation.
It was the belief about the nation itself.
Yes, it was solely the belief that the United States is and should be a Christian nation. That completely flips how we usually think about voter demographics.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that data point reviews the true power of the narrative operating system we're talking about. The researchers noted that this narrative provides a meta-narrative for a religiously distinct national identity.
A meta-narrative.
Yeah. When citizens view the nation exclusively through this narrative lens, the actual secular architectural design of the government becomes obscured.
They stop seeing the hardware.
Right. They only see the software, the story they've been told about it. And politicians know this. This framing can be extremely effective in democratic systems where political influence depends on mobilizing large groups of people.
They absolutely know it. And we see this operating systematically in the real world. The book details a perfect example of this called Project Blitz.
Project Blitz, yes, this is a crucial part of the system.
It's wild. This wasn't some fringe idea. It was launched in early 2016 by a coalition of conservative religious groups. And their stated goal was literally to elevate traditional Judeo-Christian religious values and to reclaim and properly define the narrative.
They literally use the word narrative.
They did. And they didn't just write op-eds or hold rallies. This was a highly coordinated nationwide legislative push. By 2018, they had pumped out more than 70 proposed bills across various state legislatures.
And Project Blitz is a masterclass in systems escalation. It doesn't start by trying to change major civil rights laws right out of the gate. That would cause too much friction.
Right, it operates in phases.
Yeah. Yes. 3 distinct categories, each building upon the last to slowly alter the legal and cultural landscape. Category 1 consists of what they call heritage bills.
Right, the ones that seem totally harmless.
Exactly. They are intentionally designed to seem relatively harmless or simply patriotic. We're talking about bills mandating the display of "In God We Trust" in all public schools, libraries, and police stations, or requiring public schools to offer classes on the Bible's impact on history.
Yeah, so think about the political incentive environment here. If I'm a local politician, it's really hard for me to vote against a Category 1 bill.
Because of the optics.
Exactly. If I vote against putting "In God We Trust" in a middle school, the attack ad writes itself. My opponent just says, I voted against God.
Right.
So these bills pass easily, and the purpose is to alter the visual environment of the citizen.
You change the environment to reinforce the narrative, and once that visual and cultural foundation is laid, the system moves to Category 2.
The proclamation.
The proclamations. Things like legally recognizing Christian Heritage Week or dedicating a month to the importance of the Bible in history. And these bills rely heavily on historical myths.
Oh, heavily.
They'll include preambles claiming that the first act of America's first Congress was to ask a minister to open with prayer.
Which is a complete distortion of the historical record.
It is. Or they'll explicitly claim that biblical teachings directly inspired the Declaration of Independence.
Which we'll get into later, but again, historically inaccurate. But the genius of the system is that once you've passed Categories 1 and 2, the public starts to think, well, yeah, the posters are on the wall, the governor declared Christian Heritage Week, obviously we are a Christian nation.
The perception has been successfully altered. Which brings us to the payload. Category 3.
The ultimate goal.
Yes. Once the narrative is normalized, Category 3 introduces actual hard policy changes. These are bills that seek to codify religious privilege and legalize discrimination based on specific religious views.
We're talking about real-world consequences here.
Absolutely. We are talking about bills that attempt to allow religious adoption agencies, even those receiving state funding, to refuse to place children with LGBTQ couples, or bills giving businesses the right to deny service to customers of different religions or lifestyles based on the owner's sincerely held religious beliefs.
Right, and from a purely mechanical standpoint, you cannot pass Category 3 without intense public backlash, unless you have first passed Categories 1 and 2 to warp the public's sense of their own national identity.
It's a stepping stone approach to rewriting the operating system of the law.
I want you, the listener, to really think about this for a second. How often do you hear politicians on the news or in debates use the phrase Judeo-Christian values? It's thrown around as a catch-all phrase to signal morality and decency.
And patriotism.
And patriotism, exactly.
Yeah.
But what system is that phrase actually serving? According to this analysis, it's serving a system designed to rewrite history and fundamentally alter the legal fabric of the country.
And the reason this massive narrative push is even necessary in the first place is because when we actually look at the original blueprint of the nation, the Constitution itself, we find a structural design that actively resists this narrative.
It completely contradicts it.
Yes. The architecture of the American state is intentionally, deliberately, and emphatically secular.
Okay, let's look at that architecture. Because historically, this is a massive pivot. If the Puritans were hanging Quakers and setting up strict theocracies in New England in the 1600s, how on earth did we end up with a completely secular constitution just a century later? Who looked at that history and hit the brakes?
What's fascinating here is that the founders were, above all else, acute students of history. They looked back at the European experience,
The Spanish Inquisition.
centuries of the Spanish Inquisition, the 30 Years' War, the Crusades, and they also looked at the early colonial experience right here in the Americas. And they identified a terrifying, undeniable pattern.
When religious authority and political power merge, you get violence.
Systemic, institutionalized violence. Conflicts over doctrine and legitimacy destabilize governance. The sources provide some incredibly vivid, frankly horrific examples of this happening right on American soil.
Yeah, the stuff they don't teach you in grade school.
Exactly. We're all taught the nice, sanitized Thanksgiving myth that the Puritans and Pilgrims came here seeking religious freedom for all. But the history completely contradicts this. They didn't want religious freedom for everyone. They wanted the freedom to establish their own pure Christian theocracies.
Right, they were running from persecution, so they could set up their own persecutions.
They imposed the death penalty for worshiping other gods, the death penalty for blasphemy.
For adultery.
Yes. The story of Mary Dyer is perhaps the most striking example of this, and the source notes that it heavily influenced the founders. Mary Dyer was a Puritan who converted to Quakerism.
Okay.
In the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the mid-1600s, the Puritan authorities had passed laws banishing Quakers under pain of death. They genuinely believed Quakerism was a demonic heresy.
Right, the state dictated the theology.
Yes. Mary Dyer was banished, but she kept coming back to Boston to protest these unjust laws and to support other imprisoned Quakers.
And the Puritan government, a government that was totally fused with the church, they didn't just fine her or lock her up. In 1660, they marched her to the Boston gallows and hanged her.
Hanged her until she was dead.
Simply because her internal, personal religious beliefs didn't match the state-mandated religion.
Oh.
And the source points out that Thomas Jefferson specifically invoked the execution of Mary Dyer and the persecution of Quakers as a horrifying, undeniable example of what happens when the church and the legislature share the same building.
There is another incredible story from the archives about a young lawyer in the Dutch settlement of New Amsterdam. He wrote about an English refugee, a clergyman, who had fled the religious persecutions in England. He sailed all the way to New England expecting sanctuary.
And what did he find?
He found he had jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. The Puritan authorities were so oppressive that this English clergyman had to flee again, this time to the Dutch settlement, just to enjoy basic freedom of conscience.
So the founders surveyed this entire bloody landscape. James Madison wrote about the torrents of blood spilled in the name of religion.
Torrents of blood.
Yeah. And Thomas Jefferson looked at the millions of innocent people who had been burnt, tortured, fined, and imprisoned since the introduction of Christianity into state power. And he noted that all of this violence hadn't advanced humanity 1 inch towards uniformity.
They recognized a fundamental truth of political science. Theocracy is inherently divisive, exclusive, and lethal. Separating institutional power from religious identity helps maintain stability across a diverse society.
So they had to build something entirely new, a new kind of hardware. And to do that, they turned away from theology and turned toward the Enlightenment.
Right, the Enlightenment political philosophers.
Thinkers like John Locke, Baruch Spinoza, and Montesquieu profoundly influenced the founders. I mean, take Spinoza. Here's a guy who was literally drummed out of his own Jewish community in Amsterdam in the 1600s, excommunicated for his radical ideas.
He and Locke were writing treatises discussing this wild, untested idea of a government entirely separate from religion. Locke's letter concerning toleration basically argued that the state has no business meddling in the care of men's souls.
But the crucial point here from a systems perspective is that there was no real-world antecedent for what they were proposing.
None. No other nation on earth had actually done it.
The prevailing global system was the divine right of kings, monarchs who ruled by the grace of God, with a state church backing them up and enforcing loyalty.
To break from that, the founders relied on political science, reason, observation, and experimentation. They did not rely on religious faith to construct the new government. This reliance on reason over faith is the master key to understanding the systemic design of the United States.
They viewed religion as a deeply important private matter, absolutely. But structurally, it could not be a source of political authority.
And we see that perfectly reflected in the Constitution. As the source emphasizes, the only mention of religion in the entire original text of the Constitution is exclusionary.
It's not an invitation, it's a barrier.
Exactly. It's in Article 6, Clause 3, which states, "No religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States."
From a structural engineering standpoint, that is a profound feature. Seidel calls it the most emphatic statement in the document.
In England, you had to take the sacrament of the Church of England to hold office. You couldn't be a Catholic, you couldn't be Jewish. By explicitly forbidding a religious test, the founders were deliberately divorcing religious authority from governmental power at the highest level.
You didn't have to be an Anglican, or a Puritan, or a Catholic, or even a believer at all to lead the country.
And then, of course, this separation is heavily reinforced by the First Amendment.
The famous wall of separation.
Yes, and it acts as a two-way exclusionary wall. It excludes the state from interfering in your personal religion. That's the free exercise clause. You can pray however you want in your own home or church.
But it also excludes religion from wielding the power of the state.
That's the establishment clause. The government cannot establish a national religion or favor one faith over another. And they were incredibly precise in ensuring the day-to-day operations of the government reflected this secular design.
They really were. They didn't just write broad philosophical statements. They engineered the mechanics of state power to be secular. There's a historical anecdote in the book about this that I absolutely love because it shows exactly how meticulous they were.
Oh, the oath of office story.
Yes. Picture this. It's 1789. The ink is barely dry on the Constitution. George Washington is president. And the very first bill that Congress passed under this new system was a bill to regulate the time and manner of administering oaths of office.
Right.
When they were drafting the bill, the original text included the phrases, "in the presence of Almighty God," and "so help me God," which makes total sense. That was standard legal language for centuries.
Spanish law.
Exactly. But during the legislative process, Congress deliberately stopped, took out their proverbial red pens, and edited both of those phrases out of the final law.
They removed them entirely.
They did. So basically, the very first Congress did exactly what politicians today would be terrified to do. They explicitly crossed out the word God to make sure the government's legal mechanics stayed secular.
That is a deliberate structural choice. It shows an active, conscious removal of religious verbiage from the mechanics of state power.
We also see this precursor in Thomas Jefferson's Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which heavily influenced the First Amendment.
Jefferson was incredibly blunt. He skewered what he called the impious presumption of legislators and rulers who tried to impose their own faith on others. The statute guaranteed that a citizen's civil capacities, their right to vote, to hold office, to participate in society, would not be diminished or enlarged based on their religious opinions.
But wait, I hear people push back on this all the time. They'll say, look at the founders' personal letters, look at their diaries. Many of them were devout Christians. How can you say they built a secular government when they themselves prayed and went to church?
How does Seidel address that disconnect?
Well, that's a vital question, and it's where the systems perspective provides total clarity. The founders were indeed a diverse group personally.
Right.
Some were devout Christians, absolutely. Some were deists who believed in a clockmaker God who created the universe and stepped back. Some read the Bible but weren't traditional believers, like Ethan Allen, who read it constantly but then wrote a massive book arguing against organized religion.
But their personal beliefs are ultimately irrelevant to the system they built. Regardless of how fervently they prayed in private, they intentionally kept their personal faith out of the governmental structure.
Right, because they understood that building a government based on your own personal faith is great, right up until someone from a different faith gets elected and uses that same governmental power against you.
Precisely. And James Madison explained exactly why this separation was necessary, not just for the state, but for religion itself. He argued that state and church will both exist in greater purity the less they are mixed together.
Separation protects both sides.
Yes. Separation isn't just about protecting the government from religious zealotry or theocracy. It's equally about protecting religion from the corrupting influence of political power.
When a church gets access to state power, it becomes a political entity.
And it corrupts its own spiritual mission. By guaranteeing a secular government, the founders guaranteed that citizens would have a genuine, uncoerced choice in matters of conscience.
Okay, so if the Constitution is this airtight, secular blueprint, where does this massive point of confusion come from? Why do so many people genuinely believe the founding documents are religious?
This brings us to a critical distinction in systems analysis, and one of the primary tactics used by Christian nationalist narratives. They constantly point to the Declaration of Independence.
Ah, the Declaration.
Specifically, its mention of a creator who endows men with unalienable rights. They use this as proof that the United States has a religious founding. But from a structural perspective, the Declaration and the Constitution serve entirely different functions.
They're different tools in the toolbox.
Completely different.
I like to think of it this way. The Declaration of Independence is basically a breakup letter. It dissolved the political bands connecting the colonies to Great Britain. It was a philosophical justification for a rebellion. It's not me, King George, it's you, and here's a list of reasons why we're leaving.
Right.
But a breakup letter doesn't build a new house. In fact, the source points out a great historical technicality. The Declaration didn't even technically declare independence.
That's true, it didn't. The actual legal severance happened 2 days prior, on July 2nd, 1776, when the Continental Congress approved Richard Henry Lee's resolution.
Right, the Lee Resolution.
Which simply stated that the colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. The document we celebrate on July 4th, the Declaration of Independence, was basically the press release explaining to the world why they had already taken that radical step.
Exactly. So the Declaration tore down the old system. The Constitution is the lease on the new apartment. The Constitution built the new system. It is the actual blueprint, the legal architecture of the nation.
It created the laws, the branches of government, the checks and balances.
And as we've established, that blueprint is entirely devoid of religious authority.
As John Adams astutely noted, it is much easier to pull down a government than to build one up. When they were building the new one, they completely shifted the paradigm of where power comes from. Think about the opening words of that blueprint. We the people.
We the people.
This wasn't just a catchy opening hook. It represented a massive, earth-shattering shift in political science. For centuries, the prevailing operating system of the world was the divine right of kings. Power flowed from a divine creator down to a monarch and then was inflicted upon the subjects.
We the people inverted that system entirely.
Completely inverted it. Power now flowed horizontally from the citizens themselves upwards to the government. It was human-made, human-maintained power.
I want to connect this to a famous story about Benjamin Franklin. He's walking out of Independence Hall after the Constitutional Convention, and a woman named Elizabeth Powell stops him.
I love this story.
She asks, "Well, doctor, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy?" And Franklin gives that legendary reply, "A republic, if you can keep it."
If you can keep it.
Right. A republic, from the Latin res publica, translates to a public thing. It requires human effort, human reason, debate, compromise, and constant, exhausting vigilance.
It is not handed down from a divine monarch on a stone tablet.
Exactly. And is not maintained by divine intervention. It's on us.
And that concept of human effort is why the founders constantly referred to the new nation as the American experiment. James Madison called it a great political experiment. If you read the Federalist Papers, they mention political experiments dozens of times.
George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they all use the language of scientific inquiry.
You don't build an experimental republic based on unchangeable divine law. Science and faith are fundamentally different approaches to the world. Faith requires you to accept things unseen and unchangeable. Science requires you to observe, test, and adapt.
The Constitution has an amendment process, precisely because it is an experiment that needs adjusting. Divine law does not have an amendment process.
No, it doesn't.
This raises an important question, though. If the constitutional system is built on reason, experimentation, and the power of the people, how does that align with the systems presented in biblical texts?
Right.
The author of our source material, Andrew L. Seidel, makes a very provocative argument here. He doesn't just say they are different. He argues that Judeo-Christian principles actively conflict with American foundational principles.
It is a provocative argument, but when you break it down system by system, the conflict becomes very apparent. Let's look at the core themes. On one side, you have the overarching biblical themes of obedience, absolute submission to a higher authority, and fear of divine retribution.
The text quotes the medieval theologian Thomas à Kempis, who captured this mindset perfectly. He said, "It is verily a great thing to live in obedience. Far safer is it to live in subjection."
And then on the other side, you have the American theme of liberty. The British statesman Edmund Burke, watching the American colonies rebel in 1775, noted that a fierce spirit of liberty was the predominating feature of the Americans. They hated subjection.
The Constitution's stated preamble purpose isn't to ensure obedience, it's to secure the blessings of liberty.
But the conflict goes much deeper than broad themes. The mechanisms of justice in both systems are fundamentally diametrically opposed.
Let's look at the American justice system.
Imperfect as it is in practice, its structural design is built on the presumption of innocence, individual responsibility, and rigorous due process.
The guiding philosophical principle, articulated by Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and echoed by American founders like Benjamin Franklin, is that it is better to run the risk of sparing the guilty than to condemn the innocent.
You must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and the punishment must fit the individual's specific crime.
Okay, let's play this out with a real-world hypothetical to show how different this is from biblical justice. Let's say I get a speeding ticket. In the American system, I go to court, the state has to prove I was speeding, and if I'm found guilty, I pay the fine. My actions, my consequence. But what does that look like under the biblical justice system outlined in the sources?
Under the biblical justice systems detailed in the text, we frequently see mechanisms of punishing innocence, collective guilt, and vicarious redemption. So in your speeding ticket scenario, under collective guilt, the judge wouldn't just fine you. The judge might suspend the driver's licenses of your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren because the taint of your crime is inherited.
Which is crazy to think about.
The text lists massive examples of biblical collective punishment. The killing of Egypt's firstborn children because of the Pharaoh's stubbornness. The thousands of babies and children who drowned in Noah's flood because the adult population was wicked.
The destruction of Achan's entire family.
Yes, including his children and livestock because Achan alone stole plunder. These were people who, as the Bible itself phrases it in other contexts, did not yet know right from wrong. Yet in the biblical narrative, they are slaughtered for the crimes of others.
From a legal systems perspective, that concept is horrifying. The idea of original sin, that you inherit guilt for a crime committed by an ancestor in a garden thousands of years ago, violates every single norm of American due process.
And the flip side of that is vicarious redemption, right? The idea that one person in Christianity, Jesus, can be punished to absolve the crimes of another.
That repudiates the core American principle of personal responsibility. I can't ask my innocent friend to go to jail to serve my sentence for bank robbery.
The American legal system would never allow that because it's fundamentally unjust to punish the innocent to spare the guilty.
Exactly. And this conflict becomes undeniably explicit when we examine specific codes of law, like the Ten Commandments.
Right. Christian nationalists frequently claim that the Ten Commandments are the foundational basis of American law. You see politicians demanding they be posted in public school classrooms and courthouses.
But Seidel actually goes through the Ten Commandments one by one, and it's wild when you hold them up next to the Bill of Rights. Let's just look at the very first commandment. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me.
From a constitutional standpoint, that commandment is a direct violation of the First Amendment.
It is.
The First Amendment guarantees religious freedom, the right to worship any god or a pantheon of gods or no god at all. The Constitution protects your freedom of worship and your freedom of thought. The First Commandment demands absolute ideological submission to a single deity under threat of divine wrath.
You literally cannot reconcile Congress, shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion with you shall have no other gods before me. They are mutually exclusive operating systems.
Furthermore, the narrative that American governmental structures are derived from the Bible is factually debunked when we trace the actual history of political ideas.
Right. Let's look at the separation of powers into three branches.
The executive, the legislative, and the judicial. This is the cornerstone of the American system. Christian nationalist politicians and authors often claim this brilliant concept was lifted straight from the book of Isaiah, chapter 33, verse 22. For the Lord is our judge, the Lord is our ruler, the Lord is our king, he will save us.
Wait, really? Because I hear that Isaiah quote all the time in these debates. The Lord is our judge, ruler, and king. How does Seidel argue against that when it literally lists the three functions of government right there in the Bible?
Because it completely misses the point of why the powers are separated. That verse in Isaiah is actually about concentrating all three powers into one single omnipotent being, Yahweh. He is the judge, the ruler, and the king, all at once.
Which is a dictatorship.
Thomas Jefferson specifically defined concentrating all powers, legislative, executive, and judicial, in the same hands as the very definition of despotic government. The American system separates them to prevent tyranny. Concentrating them is exactly what the founders were trying to avoid.
So the actual historical source for the separation of powers wasn't the book of Isaiah.
No, it was the French Enlightenment philosopher Montesquieu.
Let's pause on Montesquieu for a second, because we shouldn't just name drop him without explaining why he matters. Who was Montesquieu and what was he looking at?
Montesquieu was an 18th century French judge and political philosopher. He was looking at the absolute monarchy of France, where the king made the laws, enforced the laws, and acted as the supreme judge.
And he saw that this concentration of power inevitably led to the abuse of the citizenry.
In his masterpiece, The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, he argued that the only way to preserve political liberty is to separate the power of judging from the power of legislating and executing.
Because if the person who writes the law is also the judge, there is no defense against arbitrary violence.
The framers of the U.S. Constitution, particularly James Madison, read Montesquieu voraciously. They designed the three branches of government directly from his political science theories, not from a biblical verse advocating for a divine autocracy.
That makes so much more sense. But what about the basic moral stuff? The source notes that people often say, well, what about the golden rule? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Or basic laws against murder and theft. Aren't those Judeo-Christian?
The source argues there is a profound level of arrogance in claiming that basic human decency is exclusively Judeo-Christian. Claiming concepts like the Golden Rule, basic empathy, or prohibitions against murder are unique to a specific religious tradition ignores the reality of elementary human solidarity.
These concepts exist across countless cultures and philosophies that predate Christianity by millennia.
You find variations of the Golden Rule in ancient Egypt, in Confucianism, in Hinduism, in ancient Greek philosophy. Claiming them as proof of a Christian founding is both historically inaccurate and deeply dismissive of broader human morality. A society cannot function if people constantly murder and steal from each other. Humans figured that out long before the Bible was written.
Okay, so let's summarize where we are. We have an explicitly secular architectural design in the Constitution. We have foundational American principles of liberty and due process that actually conflict with biblical themes of absolute obedience and collective punishment.
We have political structures derived from French philosophers, not ancient prophets.
Which brings us to the most perplexing question of this entire deep dive. How did the Christian nation myth become so deeply ingrained in the public consciousness? If the building is obviously a secular courthouse, why does everyone walking around inside think it's a church?
The answer lies in the slow, systemic alteration of the American environment. Specifically, the evolution of American verbiage. We talked earlier about Project Blitz trying to alter the visual environment with posters and proclamations. Well, this has been happening on a national scale for over a century.
Systems often adapt during periods of extreme stress, and narrative systems are no different.
To understand this, we have to look at the original mottos of the United States and how they changed over time in response to national trauma.
When the nation was founded, the unifying motto chosen by Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson in 1776 was E pluribus unum. From many, one. I love that motto. It perfectly encapsulates the American ideal, taking diverse people, diverse religions, diverse states, and forging a single, unified, secular republic. It's brilliant.
It is brilliant and entirely secular. But look at when the religious verbiage was officially injected into the system. The phrase, "In God we trust," didn't just organically appear on currency at the founding. It was added during the Civil War.
During the Civil War, not during the Revolution.
Exactly. During a time of unprecedented slaughter, intense fear, and a literal sundering of the nation, religious leaders petitioned the federal government to add religious language to coins.
The Union was desperate to claim that God was on their side in a bloody fratricidal conflict.
The source notes the bitter, tragic irony here. The government chose to adopt a divisive religious sentiment to replace a unifying motto right in the middle of a war that was destroying the Union. They replaced, from many, one with a claim of divine favor, while Americans were slaughtering each other on battlefields like Gettysburg.
And happened again in the 20th century. I think a lot of people don't realize this. But the phrase under God was not originally in the Pledge of Allegiance.
No, it isn't.
When Francis Bellamy wrote the pledge in 1892, it didn't mention God. The phrase under God was added in 1954. Why? What was happening in 1954?
The Red Scare and the Cold War panic.
It was a knee-jerk reaction against godless communism in the Soviet Union. The government intentionally used religious language as a tool to draw a stark ideological line against a geopolitical enemy.
And then, In God We Trust officially became the national motto shortly after, in 1956, officially legally displacing E pluribus unum.
This is a textbook example of how a narrative system is constructed through environmental feedback. Think about the impact of this on a citizen's psychology.
By legally altering the verbiage that citizens interact with every single day on the money they use to buy bread and the pledge they recite every morning in their school classrooms, the system quietly trains the populace to perceive the government as inherently religious.
It creates a historical illusion. If a child grows up saying under God every morning and seeing in God we trust on their lunch money, of course they're going to assume the country was founded on religion. The hardware has been hidden by the user interface.
And this verbiage isn't just on our money. It's heavily, heavily utilized by our politicians. The source text discusses a fascinating concept called strategic piety, referencing a study by researchers David Domke and Kevin Coe in their book, The God Strategy. They looked at presidential speeches over decades to see how this verbiage evolved.
The statistics from that study are incredibly revealing. If you look before Ronald Reagan, presidents occasionally requested divine favor, of course, but they did so in less than 30% of their major addresses. It was relatively rare.
But Reagan recognized the immense political power of this narrative system. He tapped into that Cold War religious fervor. He ended 90% of his major addresses by explicitly requesting divine guidance or saying, "God bless America."
And once that precedent was set, a rhetorical arms race began.
Right, because once one guy is doing it 90% of the time, the next guy can't do it 30% of the time, or he looks like a godless heathen.
Subsequent presidents had to match it to prove their own morality and patriotism to a public whose perception had been altered. George H.W. Bush hit 90%. Bill Clinton hit 89%. George W. Bush hit 84%. It became a mandatory performance.
It becomes a compulsory political ritual. And the text points out how cynically this can be used. Think about Richard Nixon during the height of the Watergate scandal, when his presidency was collapsing due to his own corruption.
Nixon specifically asked the public to pray for him and ended speeches with "God bless America" as an emotional ploy.
It was a calculated move to remind the nation that he was part of the in-group, that he was religious, and therefore presumably moral, despite all evidence to the contrary. It's using religion as a shield against accountability and a shortcut to moral authority.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, James Madison warned about exactly this dynamic. Madison wrote that religion and government both exist in greater purity when they are kept separate. When politicians use religion as a cheap shorthand for tribal allegiance or to cover up a scandal, it doesn't just corrupt the political process, it actually taints the religion itself.
It reduces profound spiritual traditions to cheap bumper sticker slogans used to win swing states.
That is a profound point, and Seidel emphasizes this strongly. Demanding expressions of religious faith from politicians is basically begging them to lie to you in order to get your vote.
It acts as a de facto voter-imposed religious test, despite the Constitution explicitly forbidding one in Article 6. The voters are voluntarily handing over the tools of their own manipulation to the political class.
And the ultimate result is this incredibly powerful, self-sustaining feedback loop. Politicians use religious verbiage to signal loyalty and secure votes. That verbiage alters the public's perception of the government's foundation.
This altered perception then provides incredibly fertile ground for movements like Christian nationalism to emerge. They can point to the Pledge of Allegiance or the currency and claim a historical mandate that never actually existed at the founding.
And then they use that fabricated mandate to push legislative agendas like Project Blitz to rewrite the actual laws, trying to change the secular hardware to match the religious software.
So what does this all mean for us today? We've covered a tremendous amount of historical and systemic ground. We've seen that the United States was architecturally designed as a secular system. The Constitution purposefully omitted religious authority and explicitly banned religious tests.
This was not an accident. It was a deliberate engineering choice to protect true freedom of thought and religion from the bloody, terrifying history of theocracy that the founders knew intimately.
We've seen that foundational American principles like liberty, due process, and the horizontal power of we the people stand in stark contrast to biblical themes of absolute obedience, collective punishment, and divine right.
And we've seen how the Christian nation concept is a later narrative overlay, a story built on historical revisionism, fueled by periods of national fear during the Civil War and the Cold War, and sustained by calculated political incentives.
Why this matters to you, the listener, is fundamentally about clarity of perception. When you understand the difference between the structural design of a system and the marketing slogans used to sell it, you become immune to historical gaslighting.
You can see modern political battles, whether it's a debate over putting a Ten Commandments monument at a courthouse, a new law regarding what can be taught in school curriculums, or the rhetoric used in a presidential campaign, not simply as isolated, annoying culture wars.
You can see them as deliberate, systemic attempts to rewrite the operating system of the country. Understanding the true secular blueprint is the only way to protect the structure that actually guarantees your freedom of conscience.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.
I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. If a nation's foundational architecture was explicitly designed to be secular in order to protect true religious freedom, what happens to that freedom when the dominant political narrative successfully convinces the public that the architecture was religious all along? Does a repeated narrative eventually possess the power to rewrite the structural reality, or does the foundational blueprint ultimately hold strong against the stories we tell ourselves?